division among provinces, such as the dispute that's arisen between Alberta and British Columbia, cannot be allowed to fester in our country, especially not when the resulting impasse threatens both the livelihood of thousands of workers and Canada's solid reputation as a good place to invest.
It was Finance Minister Bill Morneau in Ottawa this morning after announcing the federal government had struck a deal with Kinder Morgan to buy the pipeline for $4.5 billion and build an expansion, a decision that has deepened the divide between two neighbouring provinces. What does it all mean politically? We called an emergency session of At Issue to break it down. Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, and Althia is here in Ottawa. Start with you, Andrew, because I watched your Twitter account throughout the day to see where you were going with this. Does the federal government buying a pipeline make sense? Does it make it less risky and more certain that it's actually going to happen?
There's three questions there, then.
I know, just take one.
At most times, it would not make sense. In this particular circumstances, with the political risks around this, it may well. But it comes at particular risk, certainly to the government and also to the taxpayer. The risk to the government is they become responsible for a quagmire where they are running a pipeline, owning and building a pipeline, where the costs are mounting, where they're having trouble with protesters, for example, and where they start to really wear this. The upside from the standpoint of pipeline proponents is it's more likely to get built at this point. The government is certainly, I think, committed now beyond any shadow of doubt that it wants to see this built.
Chantal, what do you think?
Hopefully it's committed, considering how much money it's willing to put on the table. I think it came down to you either saw what you saw this morning, or on Thursday you watched Kinder Morgan pull the plug on the expansion of the pipeline. Those were the options. Clearly, the government's offer of a safety net, in case there were delays caused by court cases, etc., was not going to be taken up. Kinder Morgan, it seems, wanted certainty. Let's be clear here, no government today of any stripe could provide certainty because the court process, the demonstrators are all beyond the control of a prime minister, regardless of his constitutional powers. So the risks are all now on Canada's taxpayers, and the political risks for the Prime Minister are much higher than they were a week ago.
Although we've looked at this on this program before, last week we looked at other cases where the federal government has bought into, invested in energy projects, and in all the cases we looked at, you get a return. So the economic risk, I don't know that it's that high, Althia. I mean, of course, anything's possible, but what about the political risk for the federal government here?
Well, I think there is a political risk, and you saw that by the fact that it wasn't Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, fronting this announcement, but the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. The Prime Minister had no trouble 18 months ago standing in front of reporters in the National Press Theatre, the same forum, and make the announcement that the Liberal government was going to approve Kinder Morgan. So I think that they themselves view this as somewhat politically risky. They have 18 seats in British Columbia. This is incredibly unpopular in BC's Lower Mainland, and this has been a bit of a gift, frankly, to Jagmeet Singh, who's been struggling to make any inroads. So it's good news for him. I think that there are risks, financial risks, of course, as the Chantal and Andrew have outlined. I think one thing that is notable from today's announcement is that the government refused to actually say how much they're ready to invest to get this pipeline built. The $4.5 billion is just the cost of the existing pipeline and the permits that have been obtained to build the expansion. It's not the cost of constructing, which Kinder Morgan had pegged at $7.4 billion in December. The government, through officials that meet with you but don't speak on the record, they don't have their names attached to it, acknowledge that that figure is going to be a lot higher, and they acknowledge that this is probably a medium-term hold. This is not something that they're actually realistically looking at getting rid of before they actually have to pay for it, which is a scenario they outlined for us today. So the chances of finding a buyer before August are incredibly slim.
They're slim, but they're already trying to do it actively, and there are already some conversations happening around that. Is the political risk, was it bigger to buy the pipeline, or was it bigger to walk away from it, Andrew?
I think to allow the pipeline to just, not be built at this stage would have been not suicide, but it would have been extremely damaging to the government after the many statements they'd made that it will be built. The trouble is, of course, they boxed them into a corner that way. They made it very clear to Kinder Morgan that they would do whatever it took to see that it was going to be built, including relieving Kinder Morgan of any of the risk or costs and taking it on themselves. So they kind of painted themselves into a corner.
I wondered, though, too, Chantal, whether it in some way validates, and it's a question, I'm not saying that it does, but does it validate the process they used to give the project the green light, so that if there are future projects that have to be considered, then they can say, well, this worked, and here's why. And so then that gives them some... it's a question. It's a question.
Excuse me, but I'm not even going to go there, because if that is the proof that it worked, that we are actually, we as taxpayers, buying a pipeline, and then the government of Canada becomes judge and jury as to whether the construction meets all the conditions that it imposed on the pipeline. Boy, I mean, that's, you know, I think this entire saga actually is becoming a textbook example of why we probably will not have any more of these pipelines to tidewater built in the near future. Now, that being said, it is possible over time that Canada would get a return or some of its money back or most of it back. But Justin Trudeau is racing against a different clock, which is called the election clock, and he's not going to have that proof by 2019. He's probably going to be in the middle of protest demonstrations, possibly some clarity from the courts, but this will remain a thorny issue for him going into the election.
That's an awfully good point.
May I just add, the other thing that, you know, the Liberal government has made this first mandate about has been about the energy and climate change. And it would have been really hard for the Prime Minister to go to the polls in 2019 with only the carbon tax as part of that equation and no pipeline.
But the danger between the protesters and the mounting costs and the election is that they'll be just as motivated sellers as they were motivated buyers, and that somebody will come along and just take them to the cleaners but with a lowball bid, and they'll be willing to do so to get it off their plate.
Okay, let me play this clip of Premier Notley, Premier Horgan, and do one round on where this leaves both of these premiers after this. Look.
Now we have both Ottawa and Alberta, rather than going to court to determine jurisdiction, they're making financial decisions that affect taxpayers, and they'll have to be accountable for that.
After all, this is not a conflict between provinces. BC took a run at the authority of the federal government and the interests of all Canadians. So we challenged the federal government to step up, assert its jurisdiction, and do whatever it takes to give investors the certainty that they need to see this project through.
Althia, you start us off on this. Where do you think this leaves these two premiers? Certainly it looks like one's a winner, but I'm not sure it's that clear-cut.
I think Rachel Notley has basically gotten everything that she wanted to get out of this decision. Absolutely. She has new life, perhaps, and re-election possibilities. It would have been a real disaster for her not to get this pipeline built. For John Horgan, he doesn't really lose anything either, frankly. I mean, the political risks have not been eliminated. The government announced today that it is not pushing forward with legislation to reassert its authority, which is something they had announced they were going to do back in April. And I think some people might wonder why the government is not asking the Supreme Court to look at the BC reference case, because it looks like there are legal issues here that have not been resolved, and the federal government perhaps is suggesting that it is not entirely confident in its case by refusing to fast-track that.
Chantal, what do you think this changes for those two provinces, those two premiers?
I think Rachel Notley got what she needed. I'm not sure that that will necessarily translate into re-election. That's for the people of Alberta to decide. But the reverse would have been a catastrophe, and she would then have had to pull her support from Justin Trudeau's carbon pricing plan. So confrontation would have escalated. Yeah. I think John Horgan is basically where he was before. He has made a court answer his way out of this. He has a Green Party gun to his head if he wants to keep his government in office. So he's pretty much today where he was yesterday.
Andrew?
I think this has made it slightly more certain that they will not face legal obstacles to this. I mean, it'd be one thing for the courts to say you didn't have jurisdiction over a private corporation, but to say that a federal crown corporation couldn't do this, I think is even less likely. But again, it's the political commitment as much as anything, and Rachel Notley will certainly be reassured by this. I think the chances of the pipeline being built, while there's by no means out of the woods because of some of the protesters, for example, than some of those challenges, but it's certainly materially improved at this point.
30 seconds. I don't know if we can do it in 30 seconds. Should taxpayers be worried today about this investment? Chantal?
Not yet. We did buy something, an existing pipeline for that money, and presumably it's been making money. So I think at some point down the line, possibly, but for now, what the government has done is put an existing project on a lifeline, waiting to see if it will survive challenges and demonstrations.
Okay, 10 seconds, Althia and Andrew.
Well, I think there's still unknowns, right? We don't know how the Federal Court of Appeal is going to rule. There are things that Kinder Morgan has not yet done. The 157 conditions, not all of them have been met. There are permits that have not been applied for. So the federal government is not getting like a pipeline ready to be built. There are still headaches there. So we'll see what happens. But I think that the taxpayer, I think right now the question is, why is the government not being transparent with them about the cost of this project?
Andrew?
There's huge risks. The costs could mount way beyond what we've been told so far. And we may, as I say, they may wind up selling the thing at a loss. So, yes, they're buying an asset, but one of uncertain value.
Although I think if they resell a little portion of that pipeline to all of us, or let us autograph it, you know, they might get taxpayer buy-in that way. All right, in case you're wondering, At Issue, all of these lovely people will be back again on its regular day on Thursday to discuss whatever we come up with for Thursday. Thank you all. Just a reminder, At Issue, also a podcast. Lots of extra content and, of course, the main panel in podcast form every week. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.